think about the concept of a recension, we've actually had it run across hard times lately. It's been brought into the forefront in New Testament textual criticism in a major way in times past. But I wonder but what maybe we have now discarded it in its entirety when perhaps part of the aspects of a recension should still be kept within our field. And so in light of that, we're going to look first at how the concept of recensions emerged. And then we're going to be looking at a few of the textual focuses on it in the church, early church, and then some historical examples of what recensions have been and draw a few conclusions from it. And so as we think about, let's see if this is going to work. And okay, so my computer does not like us doing that, so I'm going to do this. Hopefully PowerPoint is not frozen up on me, and I'm afraid that it might have. All right.
I'll just see how it goes.
Yeah, there we go.
That's it. Great.
Okay, so let's look at how the concept of recensions has emerged, grown, and perhaps died. Of course, most of you know that the term recension comes from recensere or recensio, from the Latin is where we get the term, to review again, to look over again. Actually, that seems to be a major focus. And then we have had it applied in more recent times for the term edit. One of my concerns brought this to the forefront is that we have a lot of websites out there that still echo older viewpoints about what recensions are, and they still promote the idea that we have recensions behind almost any given focus within the New Testament text. If we wanted that popular definition, it would be one that actually most of us probably accept, and is that a recension is a critical revision of a text, or it's a text that's established by critical revision. And so it could be the process itself of making the text, or it could be the end process. There's really not a lot of nuances in our modern understanding of the term. And that's where I think maybe we could grow some. So as we think about it, the term actually begins to be used in the mid to late 1700s. There are differences of opinion over exactly when this happens. And so what we do know is, at least Bruce Metzger, Bart Ehrman didn't really change this part. He felt like Semler was the first to apply the term to groups of New Testament witnesses. I've tried to read through some of the other writers, Bingle and others, and I can't dispute his finding. That doesn't mean he's the first one, of course, to use the term, but within New Testament textual criticism. And as Metzger would note properly, a recension is the result of deliberate critical work by an editor. And so sometimes it's used in a loose sense as synonymous with a family, meaning a family is a recension and we can trace its background. And so this concept ended up coming out especially due to Bingle's major textual groupings. And so although Bingle didn't use the term himself, we know the term does arise in that time. And so Semler assigns it when he goes to three groups, two different people. And he has people on two of them. And so his Alexandrian text, he would say, was a recension dating back to Origen by way of Hesychius. And then his Eastern would date back to Lucian as the one in the early 4th or mid 4th, early 4th, logically, for making that recension. He really doesn't give a name or anything with the Western. There are a few things tossed around, but mostly with the Latin influence coming in there. And so now we have the term recension. So how much is it used? And just for use overall, this is a recount from a study on definitions from Oxford Languages that shows more or less how popular the term was or wasn't. And what you can see is it really grows in popularity as the field itself moves forward. This is more than just our field, but our field sort of mimics the overall trend on the use of the term. And so we got very caught up with the idea of recensions. And it just kept growing. Griesbach, of course, thought that with his three textual groups, they were all actually the result of some type of recension, although for him, the Constantinople group was the combination of the Western and the Alexandrian. And so others went down there, and there's some logic to doing so, because if you have textual streams, text types, then you have to have some beginning point for them. And how do they get to where they're so distinct from each other? And that would be a logical reason for thinking, well, somebody had to make a recension, and so the names start growing. So Westcott and Hort go down that same path, and so they put forward the idea of the Syrian Byzantine text being the result of a recension in the mid-4th century, with Lucian maybe as a figure, although they don't really claim that as a definite item. And they say you can take him or leave him. He's really not certain at all as a figure behind that. And of course, their neutral text has no recension behind it. And the Alexandrian, they don't really see that as a recension. They see it as a process. And then the Western, they don't really see as a recension. So now we're down to just the Byzantine text being a recension. So how do we understand it then? Well, what's happened in the field as we come up to Westcott Hort, and that sort of holds sway until the last 30, 40 years. I was actually taught that the Byzantine was definitely a recension. The Alexandrian may have a recensional quality that takes place in the early 4th century, but that was still pretty standard teaching, and that's the Jim Brooks, Carlton Winberry heritage from Bruce Metzger with Jim Brooks. And so in that sense, what we seem to be at today is that it's the editing of a text with careful comparisons or various sources of information. And so in that sense, it's a conscious effort. And so it's an edited text. It is not an accidental item. So it's a conscious effort to alter, improve, or edit a text. With this unknown background of the text types, it just was a natural to think we have recensions. The only problem is we can't really document that. And so we think they must have been present at some point if you go back to text types. I'm speaking from the past, but there's really no direct reference. And so works like Jerome's work on the Latin text and the Syriac Peshitta end up becoming somewhat of a pattern, saying something like that must have happened. But as all of you know, there's really not any evidence there. And so with these text types, even Kurt Aland would emphasize that the diversity with the two mainstreams, Byzantine, Alexandrian, hints that there's something behind it. And so each textual stream must have something there. And that's where even Kurt Aland emphasizes there's got to be some recensional activity in the background in his earlier work. But was there a large-scale recension? That really doesn't seem to hold anymore, and that's what we pretty well jettisoned. And we would say these are processes, and it's not just a single effort that leads to these. So do we just throw out the language of recensions? Well, let's think about it a little bit. What are the historical references to recensions? Moving to another point in the presentation. And as we think about these references, they're not as many as I expected. I'll have to be upfront. I really thought that I would find a lot of references specifically to recensional activity in the Greek literature. Looking through over 400 citations using multiple keywords on a theorein or theoreo, depending on how you tend to write the root, other words that came into play. We really don't have many references with the words that we would link to recension. And so with that in mind, some of the Latin words come in, and Jerome is a key person along the way. There are definitely references to recensional works, but they don't use words like recension that we would think of that later become used in this earlier period. And most of the references deal with non-biblical texts or translations of biblical text. And so Jerome actually is pretty negative in his outlook on some of the work that's done with reference to this. But he has an axe to grind probably in what he's saying. And so his well-known statement is that I pass over those codices that are associated with the names of Lucian and Hesychius. He's referring primarily to the Old Testament, but it is written in his preface to the four Gospels. So we would assume that there's also some work on the Gospels that's in the background for him referencing this. It may be that they are codices that somehow or another are simply linked in. We don't have more proof that Lucian and Hesychius did any recensional work on the Gospels, really outside of the Jerome reference or references to the Jerome reference. And so the whole focus that's come about with text types, that we have recensions from Lucian, from Hesychius, is pretty weak on his foundations. So do we have historical samples? And there the answer is a resounding yes. And that's where most of the work comes in. I wish I could have found the actual quotes with the words. That part simply didn't come about. And so we know that there were recensions in the Greek Old Testament, because in the editions of the Greek Old Testament, we actually have Origen using it. We have early Christian writings, and there's some others. So let's look at some of these samples, because that's really where the findings came from. Within the Old Testament text itself, we would definitely call the additions to Esther and to Daniel as conscious efforts to augment the text, to do something to the text. And so those are recensions. And where this becomes helpful for us is that you can have a recension simply by adding something to a book. The added books, maybe if you wanted to get a big picture, was a change in the Hebrew canon, but I'm not really going to go down that road too much. Mostly it's the focus that you can add to a book, and the addition itself would qualify it as a recension. But in the Old Testament, with Origen's Hexbla, we get our best examples. And so we have Aquila, we have Symmachus, we have Theodotion, and an edition of the Septuagint that he puts column 5 as primarily based on Theodotion's. But we actually have known editing that Origen is using, that was done by others, editing that was consciously focused and with the translation emphasis. And so that lets us know that recensions in that sense in the early church could involve translation efforts. And a translation, therefore, was actually a recension. Jerome would even say, when translations are done, as he does on one of his, you have to pick, and he actually prefers a phrasing type of focus. We would say he's using functional equivalency or dynamic equivalency versus a formal equivalency, and because he says he doesn't stick to just the words along the way. But we do have prime examples here. Those aren't going to be the ones we also focus on even more, but let's look at the other examples. On this addition focus, you have the 3 recensions for the letters of Ignatius, and once again, this comes into a short, medium, long. The debate is there over which one, the long is usually pushed aside, which one is actually the more original. And so it could be both a recension by adding and deleting, or it may just be the addition. The norm seems to be to add for conscious editorial work on a recension. The Martyrs of Palestine, we have short and long editions, and the shorter one is considered to be the more original. And so we actually have known additions to the text that are coming about there. And that would be a recension. The Gospel of Thomas, supposedly there are deletions that have happened there. Passion of Andrew, same way, deletions that have happened there. And so you could have one that actually deletes, but in both of these cases, the reason behind it is that there were doctrinal differences or conflicts with the other text. And so they were purposely deleting passages. And so the recension was actually aimed with a theological purpose behind it. Do we have some New Testament examples? And I would say yes. We don't oftentimes phrase it this way, but the long ending of Mark would actually qualify based on what we've seen on other examples as a recension of the text, to where you have fundamentally changed the nature of the text by adding this ending. In John with the pericope adultera, you could say that's a recension as well, as it gets put into the writing, these being our two longer ones. Most other editions are not long enough to really qualify for a major recension in and of themselves with a single passage. Based on the historical examples, it needs to be substantial enough to make a difference in the reading of the text, and the examples tend to be rather substantial amounts of text added in. And so a single phrase or a single verse or something like that really probably don't qualify in and of themselves. Even though we would say they may change the meaning of the text, they don't qualify as a recension per se. So we have these two. And then, of course, we know with Marcion's work, especially by way of Tertullian, others, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, that we definitely have a recension that's done for theological purposes. And Tatian and the Diatessaron, which is an editing with no question about it. But the New Testament, therefore, did go through some recensional activity. And whether we're tying it to text types or not, notice none of these are tied to text types. These are actually totally apart from that type focus. And so we're tying it to the nature of what's being done to the text rather than to text types. So all of these could be called recensions. But the differences are pretty major among the examples. Some add to the text, Greek Old Testament, Mark, John. Origen is actually trying to improve the text. Some delete from the text. Almost all of these seem to have a theological bias behind them. And Jerome would also verify that same type focus on his concerns. But they're intentional, systematic, and done with a specific effort to where it's not an accidental overtime type item. So where does that lead us? I'm going to skip this part because I just looked at the time frame. Okay. And so what we know is we have ancient references, not so much to a term that we can identify, but we actually have references to recensional types of activity. And those are known mostly by the actual historical examples of recensional activity within the documents. So I would propose that these should be our primary points of reference for defining what a recension is. We have references to people who at times are associated with recensional editing. Some of those are positive, some are negative. What distinguishes those? Well, that's where I think we can draw a few conclusions about this. Our definitions are still too restricted by their ties to text types. And a recension may indeed involve editing a text to improve the quality of the text, but the so-called text types in the New Testament don't really qualify overall as recensions, since we can't nail it down to a conscious editing over a single episode, so to speak, one person being behind them. So my proposal is a recension should obviously no longer be used in terms of the text types, even though some may balk at that. With the Byzantine, we can't nail it down. Normally, it has to have a fairly impacting role on the work that's being dealt with. That's where the end of Mark has a big enough impact where I would call that a recension of the Gospel of Mark. But if it doesn't have enough of an impact to the overall work, then it's scribal work, but not recensional work. Or it's reader input, but not recensional work in the same way that recensions tended to be done in the early church. It may involve removing offensive content. And I think Bart Ehrman will like this because there are doctrinal focuses for recensions of text. And so he probably has a good leg to stand on with the concept of recensions in that time period. So the nature, text types don't qualify. As far as the mention overall on these, the activity in the early church can be positive or negative. It depends on the authority behind the work, the quality of the work, and the motives behind the work as to whether it will be positive or negative. And it also depends on internal church conflicts. And that would be the Jerome example, where he actually seems to have a conflict with some of those that he doesn't like on what their work is doing. So we ought to use the term recension, but to describe documents and processes with a lot of caution. it ought to impact the entire document. Some variants, if they're long enough and impacting enough, may qualify as recensions to the text. The only other one that really comes to my mind would be the ending of Romans. But I'm not sure it fundamentally changes the text. The deletion of 2 chapters, perhaps by Marcion, if the info is right, definitely would qualify. And then some of the corrections, well, it's the process. Maybe they're recensional, but it's not a clear-cut recension per se, because they may intend to alter the meaning of the text, improve the meaning of the text, but it is not actually a recension per se. And so they're not historically verifiable to a specific person or context. And so because of that, I would say we should not say they're recensions. So should we redo the meaning of the word recension? And I would say yes, because we ought to bring it back into use, but in a more restricted sense of a large-scale impact on a text by a specific conscious effort, not simply a recensional context, recensional process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. I shall unmute all of us to express our applause. And now we will continue, having muted everybody, with some questions. Again, the usual way of doing these things, let me know by chat or use the raise hand function in the participants window. And Jeff Jenkins is the first in line. So hopefully, Jeff, you've been unmuted and you could ask your question. Then I've got Jan and Joey following.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you very much, Bill, for that. And that seems like a very useful reflection for us to all take on board. I was wondering, as you spoke about what Jerome says out loud about this practice process and the produced texts, particularly in the introduction to his letter to Sunia et Fratela.
Yeah.
He uses the word there, editiones.
Yeah.
He says there are 2 sorts of, you monks need to know, there are 2 sorts of text in circulation. But it's very interesting how he aligns them. He says, one is the edition, if that's right to say that, of Origen and Eusebius, which he says is now called by most people the Lysianic, and he uses the Greek word there. And he distinguishes that one from the editio, which is found in hexaplois, in the hexaparic manuscripts. So oddly enough, he actually makes a distinction between one edition which was made by Origen and Eusebius, presumably by Origen originally, and the other one, which is in hexaparic manuscripts.
Yeah.
So that seems like quite a complex analysis of the process, but also seems to identify, for the Old Testament text, a deliberate process of producing I'm going to throw another word in here now, a different version of the text. What do you make of that, Bill?
Yeah, as you mentioned, that's definitely an Old Testament reference, and it goes back to the hexapla. And the hexapla, of course, would be a translation focus, and yet Origen would say he's comparing it with the Hebrew text. And so we can say well, just taking it there, I would say it indicates with translations, we definitely get recensional activity. It's a conscious effort when the translation is made. And so you have to look at the translation. Is it made well or not? And in his judgment, the Origen, Eusebius, Lucian Old Testament text is made fairly well. Others not necessarily as well. But he's actually weighing in on translations as recensions. And I do think that's a valid focus. that's where he also ends up later, as you probably know better than I do on Jerome's writings. He later will try to justify some of his own work, where some have criticized it for not being quite as literal as they might like it. And he will say, no, I'm purposely trying to make this to where it's not so literal. And de facto, then, all translators are traitors. And he is having to go against some of the base text in order to smooth it out. So I would say, yes, the translation focus definitely fits. I hope that came through earlier. But I would say Jerome is referring to a recensional activity on the translation of the Old Testament. And those are definitely recensions. I may not have actually got to your point, Jeffrey, but hopefully that gets to some of it.
No, that's good. Thank you. That's helpful, Bill. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Jan Krantz is next in line.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. It's great to see each other this way. That's
nice. Likewise.
Yes. Oh, there are lots of terms, of course, as you say. There's Recensio, family, editio. There is a forma that's used by Blas, actually, for the Western text of Acts. So it is time that we sort this out a bit and then have clear definitions. And I know that already von Mattei around 1800 complained about the vagueness of the terms that people used.
Exactly.
So it's 200 years later, it's high time, I think, that we should do that. So thank you for that. And you referred to Semler for Recensio, and you asked whether there was an earlier instance, maybe.
Yes.
And at least I found in Bengal, whom you also mentioned, that he uses Recensio for what Erasmus did. So that already is, you see, that. So he can call it an addition as well, but he also says that Erasmus did recensional activity. And maybe there is even a slip of the pen in Bengal when he talks about the two great families in the Apocalypse, as he knows them, as recensiones. So he can mix the terms as well. But the one who really elaborated was Semler, I think. But okay, but I would ask you to expand this into something that clarifies the other terms as well. To relate what is family, what is recensio, what is editio, or can we produce any clarity in the entire terminology there?
Very helpful, Jan. I missed that on the reference to the Apocalypse by Bengal, especially. And so I really appreciate you mentioning that one. I need to go look that up.
And it's already in the 1734 edition.
Okay. Okay.
We've got a lot of questions still to go through, and there's an interesting discussion developing in chat as well. Joey, we'll take Joey's question and Michael's question, and then I think, based on what's in the chat, we might stay on after Michael Dormandy's presentation, and anyone who wishes to can talk more Recensions afterwards. But Joey, over to you for your question, then Michael's.
Thank you. If this ends up not having a quick answer, feel free to save it until after the presentation. But I noticed in your slides that sort of in the middle there, you skipped over a couple slides that talked about Papyrus 75 and Vaticanus. Would you be able to, I guess, briefly elaborate on what your points were going to be on those slides?
Yeah, Brent Nombre has actually, of course, as I'm sure almost everybody knows, has proposed that P75 may be a bit later, 4th century. He says it could be 3rd, could be 4th. But one of his conclusions is that may bring back the possibility that the B text is recensional. And so where I think we have reason to think that's not so would be in the fact that we have church father studies on Clement and Origen that would indicate that the B text is actually not just a 4th century recension, which is where he was hinting at, late 3rd, 4th century. And so I don't think our anchors for saying that it's not recensional at that later time are totally dependent on P75. I really think that's an overstatement of it. P4's dating is being questioned again. There will be a work coming out on the Philo part in the future by a well-known scholar. I won't go further on that one, but I do know that that may shed some more light on the dating of P4. That's my hope, at least. And so, so I'm not going to put P4 in the argument at this point, but even the Church Father studies would lead us past thinking that you have to have P75 early to not have the B text be recensional. And so I think that's a fallacy that's being put forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. Can you just say, in what sense could we call, say, Luke or Matthew's gospel a recension of Mark? And in what, in what sense is that not a recension, such that recension still becomes a useful category?
Yeah, personally, I actually think it does apply to Luke and Matthew on using Mark. I mentioned that in one setting and was called down for it. But anyway, it was by an evangelical scholar. And I think he just didn't like the idea of calling them recensions. But they're augmented recensions to where you have both additions and a recension of what's there. And it's very conscious, very much a focused effort. And so personally, I actually think it does work to call those recensions. Yeah. They're a little different type than what we see on a translation. It's a different type than what we see on some of the other activity, but it's still, in a big picture, I think would qualify.
And use of that
time is running out. But
and use of that term for those other two gospels doesn't, theologically denigrate them in any way. And so I think I agree with you. Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Great. Well, thanks again, Bill, for the presentation, which has stimulated a lot of discussion.